Prison jail guards of Reddit. What's the weirdest crap you've seen while walking past a cell on your patrol? I'm not a guard, but my class to Radia County Jail once. As the sheriff took us past the padded cell, he pointed out several chip marks in the small glass window. Turns out an inmate had pulled out her own tooth and attempted to chip through the window with it. In no specific order, a butt plug fashioned out of soap, a guy furiously masturbating with the cell light on, not trying to hide anything. I mean, he was freaking going at it. Pretty much everything in the mental health unit. I didn't witness it, but some guy cut his wrist, used a pen insert as a straw to suck blood out of his wrist, spit it into a bowl, then he drank it. He passed out shortly thereafter. Crap art is hideous, especially when mixed with period blood. Guy went to the hospital for stomach pains. Apparently he tried doing butt stuff with his radio and it went past the point of retrieval. Other than the fricked up stuff, there are really some interesting people with some really interesting cases. On a road trip with my father, who is a retired correctional officer, we're bunked out in the same room. 2 beds, so I'm going to summarize a few of the stories he just told me, both somewhat NSW. The first one was about an inmate that the staff had nicknamed Poo Poo Picasso. He enjoyed finger painting abstract art using his fesses. He would do statues, sculptures and paintings on the yellowish block walls of his cell. He said it always sucked walking by because the stench was so bad, but that he actually had some talent. Unfortunately for everyone involved, they frequently had to hose down him and the entire cell after it escalated into a poo-poo palace. The other story was about a big muscle-bound black dude who turned his cell into a gym of sorts. The exercise of choice? Penis pull-ups. He'd take his bedsheet and tie it to a cell bar, then stand back and tie the other end to his penis. From there he'd open a book and balance it in the middle and throb his junk up and down to create some sort of twisted MacGyver cockexercise. No one can be sure if the exercise did anything other than kill time, but please feel free to create a resource diagram for other Redditors interested in trying it out for themselves. More stories tomorrow if anyone is interested. It's all about those Kegels, man. They aren't just for women. There was a guy I went to high school with who got locked up for smoking dip or wet or whatever it's called now. He was in jail and was being so freaking weird that they put him in his own cell. That night, he had to take a crap, so obviously he crap in his own hand. He took said crap and smeared it all over himself, mostly his head and face. He proceeded to style the crap on top of his head like hair, his favorite apparently being a mohawk. A guard walked by that morning and saw that he had a dried, crusted crap mohawk and crap all over his hands and body. Surprisingly, there was none of his crap on anything else, and that's why I don't smoke embalming fluid. Because of how our facility is set up, the inmates are able to drain the toilet in their cell and talk through it to random inmates in other housing units. Once in a while, you'll walk by a cell doing a round and see a guy huddled over the toilet, talking into it through a rolled up magazine. My wife has been a detentions officer for 8 years now, and I get these stories almost every night. She mainly works with the behavioral observational inmates. Mental cases. She says eating or finger painting with your fesses is pretty common. She also had a woman who finger painted with her period blood. My wife seems to think it's normal. Clearly she's fricked in the head. Her top story is an inmate with a colostomy bag who used to rent out the hole in his side for guys to frick. Another inmate had a walker. Whenever he would get an apple or orange at lunch, he would stab it onto the legs of the walker and use it as a dildo. They finally had to take his walker away and stop giving him apples or oranges for lunch. One of the homosexual tanks had a wedding. They stitched toilet paper together to make a wedding dress, did makeup with the dye from Skittles, and even had a bouquet of flowers made of toilet paper dyed with Kool-Aid. They even had little name cards to show everyone's seating arrangements. She wasn't there for it, but there was a guy in her jail that popped his own eye out with a spoon. Another guy ripped one of his testicles out of his scrotum and unraveled it. They came in to find him playing with it. I find one of these stories adorable. I am a CO in a medium security prison. At the beginning of each shift, we count whatever wing we are assigned to. I'll try to describe what I observed. The inmates' bunks are made of steel frames with steel springs that their mattresses sit on. As I came by this particular cell, I witnessed an inmate using a trash bag as lube and was fricking the small space between the steel frame and one of the springs. Basically, He was sitting on his bunk, had his pants down around his ankles with his dong shoved down between his thighs. Every few seconds or so he would lift himself up with his arms and shove his dong back down between the steel. He used the trash bag to soften the friction, I guess. It was used as an entry point for his dong. I didn't say crap, just kept walking. Not so much WTF as how interesting. Only been on the job for about a year at the time, been doing it a decade now, and I walk by this cell in maximum. This inmate is making all these really short, stiff, jerky movements. So I finish my security check and ask an old timer about it. Come to find out, the inmate was one of the most combative ones we had, and he was practicing martial arts as if he was wearing full restraints, belly chain, leg irons. Evidently was pretty good at it too. Well, I work in a prison and I've seen some crazy crap. One of our inmates likes to poop in his cell and wipe it all over his cell walls. Sometimes he prefers to roll it into little balls that he flicks under the cell door. Just recently, one of our inmates found out he has AIDS. He got extremely upset and threatened suicide. So, he was put on suicide watch. On suicide watch, their cells are emptied completely and clothes taken away in lieu of a suicide dress. He was pee about having his things taken away, so he decided that he was going to try and give everyone else AIDS. How? He began biting the tips of his fingers off and flicking blood all over his cell window and walls. It was pretty bad. I've seen a ton of wieners peeing, which is actually kind of weird considering I would only ever see that view if I was pee in front of a mirror. I have a lot more, but I'm sure this will get buried anyways. Not in law enforcement, but my best friend works at Texas Department of Criminal Justice as a guard. He's told me about how he's seen inmates try to hang themselves. One was definitely getting their fap on specifically to him, but one really disturbed him. He caught a man slicing his stomach open and his intestines falling out. My friend is still a college student and hates that job because of the negativity and how miserable the inmates are. I can't even imagine what you other guys go through. We had a guy who would let other detainees have sex with his colostomy hole. He was later sent to the med bay complaining about stomach pain, and they found like 23 STDs in there. His name after that was Cholestachite. County jail. We had a girl eating her own crap. One smeared crap on her face like a mask. One guy a few years ago used his crap to draw swastikas on his forehead and all over his cell walls. I saw a guy get his head stumped. He lived. We had a guy that used his crap as hair gel. A guy that swallowed batteries every chance he got. We had a cutter who would cut his skin, I guess for satisfaction or something. Went too deep and nearly bled to death. The guy who pulled his jugular out and told the surgeon not to bother because he'd pull it out again. We had a guy that knocked a steel door off its hinges. Granted, the hinges were probably old and rusted. That ISO cell was barely used. We had a guy with a colostomy bag that would routinely pull his intestines out from the bag hole. Had the guy that would stand there and finger his butthole for months at a time. The Mexican that was detoxing from alcohol and had no idea what universe he was in. He was constantly feeling around the cell and wore the skin off his fingertips and broke his wrist punching his reflection in the metal mirror. I saw the guy being dragged butt naked by his ankles down the main hallway and said, "I'm gonna make this a job for y'all," and started crapping himself. The one that really sticks out in my memory is the franchise owner of a Maryland fried chicken got arrested for DUI and she got put in a holding cell with a homeless crack W. She nearly passed out from the smell of the crack W. There's probably more. Not as much butt stuff or rape stuff. A lot of mental health stuff. It's hard dealing with them sometimes. I've been a CO for 2 years now, and in one of our segregation units we had a guy who would constantly masturbate. He would just lay on his back with his jumpsuit on with only his penis out and masturbate for hours. Then during dinner time he would take his food and masturbate on it and play with it for a while, before picking at it and eating some. When he would have to go to the bathroom he would go into one of his bowls from lunch dinner and set it under his bed. He left our prison now, but he was absolutely crazy. Worked in psychiatry and I'm checking everyone for safety. I walk into this bedroom and a nude had made a pyramid on his bed out of furniture, high roof, and was balanced dangerously on top of it, pouring milk in his eye. Not as I was walking past a cell, but when I was working in medical. The facility doctor comes up to me, "Nicotine dealer. Come check this out." I go into his office and as he stifled his chuckles, puts an X-ray on the light board and turns it on. There it was, plain as day, a cell phone up the inmate's poop chute. We laugh for a minute and he tells me I'm leaving this one on my light board. I wrote inmate violence tracking software for the Florida government about 15 years ago. It tracked inmate on inmate, inmate on guard, and guard on inmate violence. It aggregated these numbers by prison, so a guard would witness violence while on the job and would then log into my system to report on it. So on that form I had an unexplained weird crap happen type button. So the moment I got to work in the morning I would do a SQL query, where weird shit equals true. I have about a billion stories, but the one that sticks out in my mind was the guy that shot arrows at another inmate across this Oz type cell block. He had cut arrows out of a toilet brush, wrapped toilet paper and crap on the end of the arrow, set it on fire and then shot it at an inmate he disliked with some makeshift bow. Sorry for the grammar, but I am on my phone. I work in a maximum security prison. I'd have to say it was probably in our segregation unit. As I was walking by this guy's cell, he stops me and shows me a string hanging out of his mouth. I'm of course wondering what the heck he is doing, and then he starts pulling on it, and the strong doesn't seem to go anywhere. I immediately cuff him up and haul him off to healthcare, where they find a paper clip folded up at like a fish hook. He swallowed it and got it lodged into his esophagus. The same guy also liked to shove crap up his penis. Staples, pins, paper clips, plastic utensils and chicken bones. He shoved everything in it. So much stuff that he had to have his stomach cut open so the doctors could get to his bladder and unclog it. Then when he would be done with surgery he would rip out his stitches and stick his hand inside his stomach and play with his intestines. Once this happened a couple separate times, the doctors finally just decided to stop stitching him up. I'm assuming it was some kind of colostomy bag that they hooked up to him, and then they basically just left the hole open and had him on 4-point medical restraints for 23 hours a day. It's estimated that the guy cost taxpayers nearly $28 million in medical expenses. I work in a psych hospital for the criminally insane. Basically the same thing as a CO, but we can't defend ourselves if we get attacked. Oh, and they are diagnosed with immense illness. One time I was watching someone sleep, for behavioral reasons. We will call him Bob. Bob is dead asleep, snoring away at 3 AM. Suddenly wakes up and yells our new leader is Megatron and goes back to snoring. It was reported he watched Transformers that day. Not a guard, but went to jail for a month. They were smoking potato skins that they dried out from baked potatoes and would smoke it in Bible paper. Work in the mental health unit at my prison. I had to deal with a guy who carved Nazi symbols in his body and wrote all over the wall with his crap. His entire cell was browned up with what must have been a week's worth of crap. Had an inmate who can't feel his legs slice open his femoral artery. He then proceeded to use it as a weapon against officers trying to save him. Wasn't there for it, but we have an inmate who would regularly stage suicide attempts in order to get what he wants. He has bed sores, and on multiple occasions he's tugged at them until he could wiggle some intestines out. No feeling below shoulders. One time he went too far, gravity took effect, and his entrails came tumbling out. I was doing some student teaching in a max security juvenile prison. These kids were serial rapists, arsonists, and even murderers. I have two stories. The first is that the library became very important to these kids. They would hoard books in their cells and it would give them power over one another if they had a book in the series that another kid was reading. A fight over a book ensued. It was a new book and there was only one copy. One day there was an all call to the common area, and before the guards could stop him, one of the kids smashed and broke the other kid's skull against the concrete floor. Blood everywhere, over a book. The other time, which I will never forget, also involved a kid getting his head crushed. Every single door in this facility was opened from a control room at the front of the building. Sometimes you would have to hit a buzzer and look into the camera to get the person in the room to release a lock so you could swing the door open. All of the doors swung open except the ones on the quads. The kids were kept in 4 separate blocks, called quads, with sliding doors. One of the guards was leaving a quad and used his walkie-talkie to have the control room close the sliding door. The door began to close behind him and he started walking away. A student in the quad decided to peek out into the hall as the door was closing and got his head crushed in the door because the control room couldn't see him and stop the door before it happened. Fricked up, man. Not me, but a guy I worked with was a CO for 8 years but gave it up for a better paying job. In a he said the craziest thing that ever happened was he was on charge of escorting prisoners to see the counselor and noticed over a period of time that a certain prisoner was going to the counselor's office a bit more than usual. The prisoner was a huge guy with big muscles and probably 6'5". Most prisoners would be in this counselor's room for 30-minute sessions, feet cuffed and handcuffed. And one day he just happened to notice he didn't see them in the room through the window, but he heard a sound. A light wisp of a sound that there may be a struggle while doing his rounds. He barged in and right behind the door the male counselor was sucking the prisoner's dong. The door and hit the back of the chair, shoving his dong down his throat and causing the counselor to choke. The counselor begged him not to say a word, but he had to. He said prisoners were having sex not only with other inmates but with the staff as well. I had no idea. Non-butt or poop story. I worked at a county jail for an internship during my last semester at college. School and the jail were over 100 miles from my hometown. One night doing rounds on one of the more secured units, one of the inmates called me over and just started a regular conversation with me. In the middle of talking he asked about my mother by name. Okay, maybe he just got lucky and guessed her name. The inmates only know our last names and no one called each other by their first names. I'm curious at this point. I play along and say she's doing well. He then goes on to ask me about the rest of my family, including my dog, all by name. Now I am freaked out and I look up his information. Guy's not even from the same state. To this day don't know how he got all that information. Just started as a CO and on my first day after training I had to help strap a guy who was covered in his own crap into a restraint chair. He was hitting his head on the wall, so we moved him to the padded cell where he is under direct supervision as well as on camera. He stripped naked and smeared his crap on the window and on the camera lens. We needed to keep an eye on him, so we went into his cell and restrained him. He fought a little bit but didn't need to since he was covered in crap the whole time. Assuming since I was new, he kept telling me I had a pretty mouth. That was my first actual day. A few years before I got on, there was a man who came into the drunk tank to detox for a few hours. He was to be released with no real charges pressed against him. He had been taken in on drunk in public. He killed another man while in the holding cell by wrapping his shirt around the man's neck and choking him to death. The officers on duty at the time heard the other 3 people in the cell start to yell a few minutes after it happened. I can only assume that's when one of them either woke up or was about to become the second victim. A man who was supposed to be there about 6 hours hasn't left since. His trial is just wrapping up and all things point to him leaving in the next few weeks for prison. He's remarkably normal to talk to. He has also never once denied what he did. I once saw a guy take a pencil out of his butthole and stab himself in the eye with it. I was an intern at a county jail. Dude was facing life, perhaps death penalty, in prison, and he was desperately trying to get transferred to a medical hospital so he could try to escape. He was complaining about some medical problems and I just got through telling him that he was not going to the hospital when it happened. Needless to say, he went to the hospital. He came back from the hospital in worse shape than he went in because he got the crap beat out of him when he tried to escape. Worked in a county jail for years. Worked in administrative isolation units a lot. The whole county jail's version of the shoe. When I worked nights, I used to walk the tier and do count. Each cell had 1 inmate. Not very hard. It was night and the lights were off, so I had to shoot my light into the cell to illuminate it. Over the years I saw some pretty crazy crap. I saw a guy slamming himself with a pencil in a 1056A. I saw dongs being tugged on constantly. I saw guys pee and crapping on themselves infrequently, but it happened. But one time really sticks out in my mind. I am doing my count and I flash the light into a cell. In the cell, the sole occupant is completely naked and spread eagle on the top bunk with his starfish facing the cell door window. He was furiously beating his dong with his right hand, and his left hand was wrist deep in his poor butthole. I stopped, watching his movements in the harsh light of my LED flashlight, and the inmate turned his head and peered into my soul. I kept walking. A few hours later, I conduct another count and I'm dreading looking in the cell. I glance in. Dude is sitting at the desk fully dressed with his reading glasses on, looking over the newspaper. He looks up, gives me a head nod, and says, "What's up, Dep? Just another day for him. Nothing to see here." I worked at a theater internment facility in Iraq. Doesn't get much weirder than seeing a nearly 5 foot 4 inch tall Iraqi that's easily 200 pounds of pure muscle grab a 6 foot 300 pounds piece of crap Iraqi guard and throw him off of a catwalk 15 featuring above a concrete recreation area onto a ping pong table. My girlfriend is a social worker and sometimes needs to visit jails and holding cells. One time she was being guided by some guards through the jail cells under the magistrate's court, and in one cell there was a big picnic blanket on top of what looked to be 2 bodies. Obviously horrified, she asked the guard what was under the blanket, and as soon as she did 2 women ripped away the blanket and continued to eat one another out in front of everybody. Apparently they did not know one another, weren't there for the same reason, and just started to give each other some head. It sounds like a lot of these people shouldn't be in general population. Is it really that hard to get into a more psychological based location, or is there mental instability due to their incarceration, which should also make you question the system a bit? Too much effort to care for them in a psych ward, I guess. Keeping mentally ill people locked up sounds pretty cruel and unusual to me, but our mental health system in the USA is crap. We had panic buttons, meant for emergency use only. We received a distress on one of the buttons, and I was the first responder. I ran into the section, and there was a fellow guard standing in front of a closed cell, zombified, and pressing the panic button repeatedly. I pushed him out of the way to see what was going on inside, and there were 2 guys, cellmates, sitting nude, cross-legged, and each was fapping the other. I asked them what the heck's going on, and I will never forget the response. "We're just sitting here jacking off, and that mother won't stop watching us." I work in a women's facility and spend most of my time in our acute and subacute area, which is for mental illness and low functioning individuals. I've seen more gross naked flesh than I could ever wish to view. I remember one time we had someone who was on dry cell due to them attempting to flood their cell. So this individual would crap in the middle of the floor. She would attempt to eat the trays meals were served on, so she was given finger foods on trays. With this she received tortilla for a carb source. Grossest thing I've seen to this day. That night she had crap tacos. I worked on a veterans PICE ward. One of my co-workers got his cheek bit off from a patient. I was the only one not to get hurt in my 2 years working there. Needless to say, I took another job. Better pay, but nonetheless I have my cheeks. Still work same hospital. I hear crazy crap every day. Years ago I was actually a patient in a mental hospital after a suicide attempt, and my roommate had a night nurse that sat between us as we slept to make sure the other girl, who was prone to hurting herself at every chance, didn't do so. I actually found comfort in having someone watching over me as I slept because, as a female, I feared the males, who lived in the same hall, wandering into my room at night after having a bad experience once. Anyway, I was sound asleep and was woken up by screaming and my bed being knocked around. The roommate had hidden her hairbrush that was given to her by the hospital and secretly broken it at the thin neck part and had started slicing herself all over with the sharp point. Blood was everywhere. 3 large orderlies came in to hold her down and gave her a sedation shot. There was also a large, young black girl who walked around singing in the halls and into corners all day and night. It drove me nuts. I tried to have conversations with her, but she was out of it. I'm guessing a bad drug trip. I never found out. A few days later she started normalizing and we became allies. I have actually seen a lot more crazy stuff in the psych wards, but those 2 jumped out at me first when thinking back. It has been 15 years since I was a CO, but this one comes to mind. 3rd shift. My pod was mostly AM kitchen workers. Saw a new name on my roster in a cell by himself. Didn't know him. It was a quiet pod with not much bulls going on, and the count office usually kept that in mind when moving inmates into it. After 2 AM count I saw his lights turn on. A little while later he calls out, "Hey CO, I need to talk to you," so I finish my coffee, grab my flashlight and head over there. I look through the window and he's sitting on his bunk pumping blood from the big vein in the crook of his elbow saying, "The angel told me to do it." Turns out he had just been released from psych observation and hadn't been showing up to pill call. Frick, what a mess. By the time medical had the bleeding stopped and was taking him out, he had bled out enough that he was turning grey and passing out. He later kited me to thank me for saving his life. My so is a corrections officer at a jail and he works in the psych unit. My favorite story he told me is about an older inmate who apparently has partial brain damage from a previous motorcycle accident. This guy walks around the unit pawing in the air like a cat and meows randomly. Miso said when the Lion King comes on the TV, he goes crazy meowing and pawing at the TV the entire time. He's also apparently soft-spoken and nice from what Miso describes, but when you talk to him he acts like a cat. He tells PPL to call him Simba BTW. One time he was on the phone and another inmate walks up to him and proceeds to rush him. All of a sudden this soft-spoken cat man flips a switch, turns to the guy and in his deep voice says, "Do something then, mother, or are you gonna cry to the CO like a little bee?" and proceeds to continue with his phone call. In his soft-spoken voice, the other inmate turns to look at Miso, who is also surprised at Simba's outburst, and back at Simba in shock and just walks away. Forgive the grammar and spelling, I'm on my phone. The guitarist of my band is a prison guard. I asked him the question. I've seen a guy softening pasta in his toilet before cooking it and serving it to a dozen other guys. A gay guy decorate his room like a teenage girl. I've had to tug a war with a towel covered in crap with a guy. Guys, toilet pasta. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.